Now, before moving forwards and looking at any other concepts, including the concepts of rotation, I want to consider the issue of gizmos within Unity. Now, gizmos are in one sense very, very useful, and in another sense entirely useless. Gizmos are useless in the sense that when our gamer actually comes to play our game, the gizmos will have no tangible effect on the gameplay. The player will never be able to see or understand or appreciate the gizmos. There will be no gizmos or anything for the player to see. So in that sense, in the final result of our game, gizmos have no effect. Rather, gizmos are a useful diagnostic tool for us as developers while developing the game. So for example, if I create a completely new object in the scene by choosing game object and then create empty, and I put this into the scene, this may be the basis for an object that may become, for example, an enemy character. Now that character may have a line of sight, it may have a range in which when the player enters that range, the enemy will start firing. But the question is, how far is that range? It might be useful to visualize that range as a sphere within this scene so that we can actually see when the player enters the enemy range and how large that range is spatially within the scene. Sure, we can define it mathematically, but often a picture is worth 1,000 words, and what would be great is if we could have Unity draw the range of that object within the scene so that we can see how far that enemy character could shoot or could travel. Of course, range is not the only concept that gizmos can be used to visualize, but it's one of the most common. So for example, I have created here inside this folder, scenes gizmos, I've created this script file. We'll see the source code for this in just one moment. But what I'm going to do is drag and drop the gizmo show script onto this object that I've created. In fact, I'm going to select that game object and just rename this to gizmo object. Now on assigning this script to this object, you will see straight away that a green sphere is drawn around that object. In fact, if I remove the component entirely, the sphere disappears. And if I drag and drop it onto the object again, we get that sphere back, which indicates that this gizmo show script is drawing this sphere. And in fact, down here for this property that says range, this controls how large that sphere is. So I can increase it and I can use the slider to decrease it. So this can be used, for example, to represent the range of an enemy object. And this construction of this wireframe sphere allows us to visualize the range of this enemy within the viewport so that we get a picture or an image of how far that is. Now let's take a look at this code inside MonoDevelop to see exactly what's going on. So I'm going to bring MonoDevelop into here and have a look at this code and explain how it works. So we have this gizmo show script, which is derived from mono behavior. So this was created just like any regular C# script file. I just right clicked and chose create C# script and I called it gizmo show. Now you can see that we have some properties here. We have show gizmos, a Boolean variable for whether or not we should show gizmos at all. This gives me the ability to toggle them on and off. We have an icon section and I will come back to that shortly. But in particular, I want to have a look at the object range. So this is a floating point range that we can define, which might represent the shooting range, the firing range, the attack radius of an enemy. So I've defined this in terms of its diameter here. So we have the range and it's specified as 10 meters by default, that is. But we have this function or this event called onDrawGizmos. Now this is a Unity defined event. That is, Unity will call this event automatically for this object, and this function is called even while the editor is running. So even when the game is not in play mode, Unity will still be running that function to draw things inside the scene viewport. So it's important to make sure that you don't introduce some errors into here. Now the first thing I'm doing is checking to see whether we should show gizmos at all. If we shouldn't show gizmos, I simply return and exit the function so that nothing else happens. But what we want to do down here is to draw the sphere. So we have this class here called the Gizmos class, and the Gizmos class supports a range of different functions and properties. So I use gizmos.color and I give it the color of green. Here I'm going to be specifying the color of all the things that I draw afterwards. So here I'm selecting the color green, and in the next line, I'm drawing a wire sphere. I'm specifying the center of the sphere, which happens to be the position of the object, transform.position. That's going to mark the center of that sphere, and simply the radius of the sphere will be range, which is specified by the floating point property up here, and the sphere will be drawn according to the green property and will be drawn at that size. Notice that the range is specified by this floating point property, and I've appended above it the attribute range. When you append this attribute above any numerical property like a floating point value, and you specify a minimum and you specify a maximum, it will give you a slider inside the editor, the object inspector. So when I move the object, when I move MonoDevelop out of the way and I select my Gizmo object, you can see that the range value is not just a type in, which is at the right hand side here, but it has this slider, which I can simply drag and move around the slider control to change the value specified here. So this attribute range will give you that slider inside the object inspector. Notice also that I'm using another color here, blue, and I'm drawing the forward vector for this object. So notice I'm specifying the center point of the object here, which is the first point on a line. I'm using draw line, for example. So this is the first point on the line, the position of the object. And then I'm measuring out the second position on a line. Now notice what I'm doing here is I'm using the vector arithmetic that we have seen previously for moving an object. I'm taking the position of the object, I'm adding to that the forward vector multiplied by my range. And this is giving us the destination point or the end point of the line. I'm saying stay where you are or keep the original position and add to that my forward vector multiplied by the range, which creates that scaled displacement vector moving away from our center position. And that's how I'm creating the destination point for this line. So the draw line function takes a start point and an end point, and that end point is calculated by using vector arithmetic. Now if I bring in a web browser window, you can see here at the Unity documentation, docs.3d.unity3d.com, we have this Gizmo reference, and it lists all of the properties and functions for the Gizmos object. So we have the onDraw Gizmos and onDraw Gizmos selected functions, which are called automatically by Unity. The selected function draws the gizmos only if the object is selected, and onDraw Gizmos will draw the gizmos regardless of whether the object is selected. We have the color variable, and we have different functions for things that we can draw. We can draw cubes, we can draw textures, icons, lines, meshes, rays, spheres. We can draw all kinds of things that can help us better visualize how our scene is working. Now I'm going to move the web browser window out of the way here, and in fact I'm going to move back to the Unity editor. And you can see that we have our gizmos drawn. Notice that if I deselect the object, the gizmo is still drawn, and the blue line is drawn here to indicate the forward vector of the object. So if I select this object and I rotate it, for example, around to here, you can see that that blue line is rotating to express the forward direction of the object. Now it may be for you that you are not having the gizmos appear in the game tab. It's possible they won't show up here, and to fix that, what you can do is just maximize the game tab, move your mouse cursor over the game tab, press Shift Spacebar on the keyboard to maximize that view, and you'll see up here on the top right hand side there is a button that says Gizmos. If you click on that button, you can toggle gizmo visibility on and off. So I can click it to turn it on and off. So I want to on so that in the game tab I can still see those gizmos, and that's looking pretty good. But if I go back to MonoDevelop, you will see that there is an additional piece of code regarding an icon to draw, and that is what I'm going to consider next.